Number 1. Texas Tower 4. By the late 1950s, the United States Air Force had grown obsessed with a single nightmare: Soviet long-range bombers slipping across the Atlantic, undetected until the moment they appeared over the eastern seaboard. The answer was the semi-automatic ground environment, an air defense network that stitched together radar stations from Maine to Florida. Inland coverage was easy. Coverage over open water was not. The Air Force decided to build radar platforms at sea, copying the design of Gulf of Mexico oil rigs but scaling them up. They called them Texas Towers. 3 were built. 2 sat on shallow fishing banks. The third, Texas Tower 4, was different. It was planted on unnamed shoal, 84 nautical miles southeast of New York Harbor in 185 feet of open Atlantic water. The structure was a triangular deck 210 feet on each side, weighing 4,500 tons, balanced on 3 tubular steel legs, each 12.5 feet in diameter. The legs went 70 feet into the seabed. The deck stood 70 feet above mean sea level. From the day it was finished in 1957, engineers worried about it. In September 1960, Hurricane Donna ripped through the diagonal bracing on Leg A. The damage was logged. Repairs were scheduled for the following spring. They never happened. In January 1961, Hurricane Esther was forecast to track up the eastern seaboard. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Gordon Phelan, requested a full evacuation. He was overruled. 1st Air Force Headquarters at Stewart Air Force Base ordered a partial rotation only. 14 of 42 men were taken off. 28 remained. The wives of those 28 men, mostly on Long Island, had been issued single sideband radios so they could speak to their husbands during long deployments. Several were tuned in on the evening of January 15, 1961. At 7:21 Eastern Time, the final transmission came through. Coast Guard radio man George Sullivan logged the words, "We are breaking up. There was nothing after that." The next morning, the Coast Guard cutter Hamilton arrived at the platform's coordinates and found open ocean. The wreckage was located weeks later by Navy salvage divers. The platform had collapsed laterally, twisted onto its side, the deck partly crushed. Bodies were recovered through the spring of 1961. Metallurgical analysis later showed that the Donna damage had become a fatigue crack network, finally severed by Esther's 50-foot wave loading. The Air Force quietly abandoned the entire offshore Texas Tower program. The wreck remains a war grave today in 190 feet of water, a bronze plaque attached to it listing the 28 names. Most of the country has never heard of it. The wives remembered. Not all Cold War Atlantic hardware fell from above. Most of it was dropped on purpose by the millions. Number 2, the Atlantic Sonobuoy Graveyard. A sonobuoy is a single-use submarine detector. The concept dates from the Second World War, when Allied aircrews realized they could drop expendable hydrophones into the water and listen for the rumble of German U-boat engines. By the 1950s, the United States Navy had industrialized the idea. The AN/SSQ-41 became the standard NATO sonobuoy in 1969. It was a cylindrical aluminium tube 4 7/8 inches in diameter, 36 inches long, weighing 17 pounds. It came packed inside a parachute housing. When dropped from a patrol aircraft, the parachute deployed, the buoy hit the water, and a piezoelectric hydrophone descended on a thin cable to its preset depth. Then the buoy listened. For up to 8 hours, a sonobuoy radioed its acoustic data back to the aircraft. After that, a small magnesium scuttling charge activated, and the buoy sank. The Navy did not want functional sonobuoys floating around for Soviet trawlers to recover. They were designed to disappear. Between 1955 and 1991, the United States Navy alone dropped an estimated 12 to 20 million sonobuoys into the North Atlantic. The Royal Navy and the Canadian Forces added several million more. The Soviet equivalents, the RGB-N Iva and the RGB-NM Chinara, were deployed from Tupolev 142 and Ilyushin 38 patrol aircraft into the same waters. The densest deployment zone was the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom Gap, the choke point that every Soviet submarine had to transit to reach the Atlantic. Dr. Robert Spindle of Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution estimated in 1992 that the North Atlantic seabed below 1,000 meters contains more man-made electronic devices per square kilometer than any other ocean basin on Earth. Each sonobuoy holds a lithium thionyl chloride battery, a copper wire antenna, a piezoelectric crystal of lead zirconate titanate, and various solders and circuit components. The estimated cumulative mass on the Atlantic seabed is over 4,000 metric tons of lithium and 12,000 metric tons of copper wire. Some of the older variants from the 1960s used radium-2 26 luminous paint on internal dials. Later variants used tritium gas-filled glass beads. The Soviet pressure sensors used americium-241. All of these radioactive elements are still down there, sealed inside the casings, slowly degrading. In 1986, the research vessel Endeavour pulled up a sediment core from the Sargasso Sea at 4,200 meters depth. The core contained 3 intact 1968 vintage sonobuoys. Naval Underwater Systems Center technicians documented ghost signals attributable to legacy units as recently as 2003. Marine biologists have observed Osedax bone-eating polychaete worms colonizing sonobuoy casings as substrate. No nation has ever proposed a recovery program. The estimated cost would exceed $200 billion. The sonobuoy graveyard will remain on the Atlantic seabed for as long as the Atlantic exists. Sometimes Cold War cargo was not expendable. Sometimes a single accident lost an entire industrial-scale nuclear shipment. Number 3. The Mont-Louis uranium hexafluoride disaster. In 1973, France and the Soviet Union signed a commercial nuclear agreement. French utility EDF would send natural uranium hexafluoride to Soviet centrifuge plants for enrichment. The enriched fuel would come back as reactor-grade material. It was an unusual arrangement given the Cold War political climate, but the economics were excellent. Soviet centrifuges were the cheapest in the world. The shipping was handled by a French roll-on, roll-off cargo ship called the Mont-Louis. It was operated by Compagnie Générale Maritime, built in Brittany in 1973, 4,500 tons dead weight. On the night of August 24, 1984, the Mont-Louis departed Le Havre, bound for Riga in the Soviet Union. Her cargo consisted of 30 cylinders of uranium hexafluoride, totaling 350 metric tons of UF6, plus 22 additional tons of low specific activity radioactive material. The cylinders were Type 48Y industrial transport containers, each 1.2 meters in diameter, 3.8 meters long, weighing 12.7 tons fully loaded. At 2:13 in the morning on August 25th, in dense fog 12 nautical miles north of Ostend, Belgium, the Mont-Louis collided with the Cypriot-flagged car ferry Olau Britannia. The Mont-Louis was struck on the port side amidships. The breach flooded the cargo hold. Within 47 minutes, she had capsized and settled in 14 meters of water on the Gute Bank Shoal, a busy shipping lane in the southern North Sea. All 18 crew were rescued by helicopter. The cargo was not. French nuclear authorities, working with the Belgian Environment Ministry, mounted a 32-day salvage operation. The Dutch salvage company Smit Tak recovered 29 of the 30 cylinders intact between September 5th and October 7th, 1984. Container 18. A was found breached. A 40-centimeter tear ran along its welded seam. Uranium hexafluoride reacts violently with water. The chemistry is uncompromising. UF6 plus 2, H2O yields UO2F2 plus 4 HF. Translated, the cargo became uranyl fluoride, a soluble mildly radioactive compound, and hydrofluoric acid, which is highly corrosive. Sediment cores around the wreck site found uranyl fluoride concentrations 200 times background levels in the immediate vicinity of the breach. The French government's official public statement put the released uranium mass at less than 100 kilograms. Internal classified reports from the Commissariat à l'Énergie Atomique referenced 800 to 1,200 kilograms. Belgian fishermen working the Gouda Bank reported skin lesions and refused to trawl the area for 2 seasons. They received a settlement from France in 1986. Subsequent monitoring by the Dutch Institute RIVM in 1989, 1995, and 2003 confirmed elevated uranium-238 in surface sediments within a 2-kilometer radius. The Mont-Louis hull was towed to Zeebrugge and broken up. The seabed residue was never remediated. The incident triggered Council Directive 92/3 Euratom, which now governs radioactive material shipping across the European Union. A standing advisory still recommends against bottom trawling within 1 kilometer of 51 degrees 23 minutes north, 2 degrees 50 minutes east. The Mont-Louis is the only known major uranium hexafluoride loss to the marine environment in commercial nuclear history. Industrial mistakes are one kind of horror. Deliberate military concealment is another. Number 4. Project Iceworm, and Camp Century. In 1959, the United States Army Corps of Engineers began excavating a city beneath the Greenland ice cap. The public face of the project was Camp Century, described as the world's first under-ice nuclear-powered research base. It was that. It was also a demonstrator for a far larger plan called Project Iceworm. The secret intent was to deploy up to 600 Iceman intermediate-range ballistic missiles in a network of mobile rail tunnels beneath the Greenland ice sheet, submoving with 4,000-kilometer range, covering the western military districts of the Soviet Union. The Danish government, which controlled Greenland, was told only of nuclear research. The full Iceworm intent was hidden from Denmark for 36 years, until declassification in 1995 revealed the deception and caused a political storm. Camp Century itself was substantial. 21 tunnels totaling 3 kilometers in length excavated using a Swiss-designed Peter Plow ice cutter beneath 30 meters of accumulated firn. Power came from the PM-2, a portable nuclear reactor, a 10-megawatt thermal, pressurized water reactor, the first reactor ever installed beneath ice. It ran from October 1960 to July 1963. The base housed up to 200 personnel year-round. It had a chapel, a hospital, a recreation hall, science laboratories, and the first ice core drilling rig ever to reach Greenland bedrock at 1,387 meters depth. The Iceworm missile concept died in 1966. A classified glaciology study by Henri Bader at the Snow, Ice, and Permafrost Research Establishment in Wilmette, Illinois, showed that Greenland ice was deforming laterally at 1.5 meters per year. The launch tunnels would crush themselves within a decade. The reactor was removed in 1964, but the contaminated primary coolant loop, which carried cobalt-60 and other activation products, was abandoned in place. The base was officially closed in 1967. What was left behind? 200,000 liters of Arctic-grade diesel fuel, 24,000 liters of polychlorinated biphenyl transformer coolant, 65,000 cubic meters of biological waste in ice-walled sumps, and several hundred cubic meters of solidified low-level radioactive waste. The Army's position was that snow and ice would entomb everything indefinitely. In 2016, Dr. William Colgan of York University in Toronto published a paper in Geophysical Research Letters projecting that surface melt under high-emissions climate scenarios would begin exposing the upper Camp Century waste layer between 2090 and 2110. 2024 ground-penetrating radar surveys by NASA's Operation Ice Bridge confirmed the tunnel network is still distinguishable beneath approximately 35 to 40 meters of compacted firn. Meltwater from the Camp Century area drains through the Nyogalfjordsbray glacier system into the Greenland Sea on the Atlantic margin. Sediment cores from Nyogalfjordsfjorden taken in 2019 show measurable PCB levels consistent with the predicted release profile. No nation has accepted cleanup responsibility. Denmark, the United States, and the Greenland Home Rule government are locked in a legal stalemate. Camp Century sits frozen and waiting, a Cold War time bomb buried beneath a melting ice sheet, releasing its contents into the North Atlantic one fjord at a time. Camp Century was an accidental orphan. The next Cold War horror was deliberate, sanctioned by treaty, and lasted 33 years. Number 5. The Northeast Atlantic Deep Radioactive Waste Dump. The story begins in 1949. Britain, faced with the early waste output of its nuclear weapons program and prototype reactors, made a quiet decision. The deep ocean was a convenient disposal site. Steel drums of low and intermediate level radioactive waste, weighted with concrete or bitumen, would be towed out into the Atlantic and dropped. By the 1960s, the practice had grown into a multinational program. In 1967, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's Nuclear Energy Agency formalized what was already happening. 3 primary dump sites were designated in the Bay of Biscay and the Iberian Atlantic Basin. Site A at 45 degrees north, 12 degrees west. Site B at 46 degrees north, 17 degrees west. Site C at 42 degrees north, 14 degrees west. All 3 at depths between 4,400 and 4,800 meters. 12 European nations contributed. The United Kingdom dumped the most by mass. France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Sweden, Italy, West Germany, Greece, Spain, Portugal, and briefly Ireland all participated. Total mass dumped, approximately 142,200 metric tons, packaged in 222,000 individual barrels containing 47,000 terabecquerels of radioactivity at the time of dumping. 95% of the waste was classified as low level: rags, gloves, filters, contaminated equipment. The remaining 5% was intermediate level: irradiated metal components, evaporator concentrates, and entire reactor pressure vessels from the British Magnox prototypes. The plutonium content alone amounted to 51 kilograms of weapons-grade material. The standard packaging consisted of 200-liter steel drums lined with concrete or bitumen. The theoretical containment lifetime was 10 to 25 years. The barrels have now been on the seabed for over 60 years. The dumping was halted in 1982 after Greenpeace activists in the ships Sirius and Cedarlie intercepted British dump vessels in the Bay of Biscay and photographed the drums going over the side. Spanish and Portuguese government opposition pushed the International Maritime Organization into a moratorium. The London Convention's 1993 amendment banned all sea dumping of radioactive waste permanently. In 1985, the French submersible Siana surveyed the dump sites at 4,400 meters. It found that the average drum had corroded 30% of its wall thickness, 3 times the design assumption. A 1992 follow-up survey by Ifremer's Nautil documented numerous drums with full wall perforations. Some were visibly leaking black contaminated bitumen onto the surrounding gray sediment. Sediment cores within 100 meters of dumped barrels show plutonium and americium concentrations elevated by 2 to 3 orders of magnitude above background. Marine biologist Tony Rice led the most recent academic survey from 1998 to 2001. He confirmed biological uptake of cesium-137 in deep-sea fish near the dump sites at levels 3 to 10 times background. Plutonium-239 has a half-life of 24,100 years. On any meaningful human timescale, the Atlantic dump is permanent. State-sanctioned dumping is one form of Cold War legacy. Failed covert operations leave behind a different kind of evidence. Number 6. The Bay of Pigs Invasion Rex. Operation Zapata was the code name. The plan was to land 1,400 Cuban exiles of Brigade 2, 506 on the southern coast of Cuba at Playa Girón and Playa Larga on the morning of April 17, 1961. The Central Intelligence Agency had organized, funded, and trained the brigade. The naval component consisted of 5 Second World War vintage merchant ships chartered through CIA front companies: the Houston, the Rio Escondido, the Atlantico, the Caribe, and the Lake Charles. 2 of the 5 would not survive the morning. The Houston, 4,400 gross register tons, was loaded with 180 men of the 5th Battalion plus ammunition and communications equipment. At 6:30 in the morning, Cuban Hawker Sea Furies and Lockheed T-33 jets of the Fuerza Aérea Revolucionaria attacked the convoy. Lieutenant Enrique Carreras of the Cuban Air Force scored the decisive 5-inch rocket hit on the Houston's engine room. Captain Luis Morse beached the burning ship at Punta Casilda. The men of the 5th Battalion never reached their objective. The Rio Escondido was a larger ship, 8,200 gross register tons. She was attacked at 9:25 by a section of Cuban T-33 jets led by Lieutenant Alvaro Prendes. Multiple rocket hits ignited the 145 tons of aviation fuel and the 10 days' worth of brigade ammunition stacked on her deck. She sank in 4 minutes, approximately 5 kilometers offshore from Playa Girón. Crew and brigade members floated for kilometers in the burning fuel slick. The losses included 100,000 rounds of small arms ammunition, 200,000 rounds of .50 caliber, 28 tons of medical supplies, the brigade's main radio, replacement parachutes, and a CIA payroll safe containing approximately $115,000 in cash, plus boxes of forged Cuban currency. The communications gear, AN/GRC 9-field radios, and AN/PRC 10 walkie-talkies, was meant to coordinate the entire landing. Its loss crippled the operation within hours. The Houston rests at 30 meters depth. The Rio Escondido rests at 50 meters. Both lie in the warm, low-oxygen waters of the Caribbean continental shelf. The Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces reached the Houston within a week and salvaged usable weapons. Some of that material is now displayed at the Museo de la Revolución in Havana. The Rio Escondido steel hull has been encrusted by hard coral growth, forming what Cuban marine biologists describe as an artificial wreck reef with at least 47 established fish species and a resident nurse shark population. A small portion of the CIA payroll safe was recovered by Cuban divers in 1962. Approximately $40,000 in cash was retrieved. Carlos Alzugaray's 1989 Marine Archaeology Survey documented both wrecks. A 1999 United States Geological Survey side-scan sonar imagery campaign by Russell Belmar's NOAA team confirmed the locations. No American researcher has ever physically dived them. The political fallout from the operation was severe. Allen Dulles resigned as CIA director 7 months later. John F. Kennedy spoke the line about victory having 100 fathers, defeat being an orphan, 4 days after the wrecks went down. The wrecks themselves remain underwater Cold War monuments, accessible only to those whose government still controls the political memory of what happened above them. The next Atlantic Cold War tragedy involves not a covert operation, but a peacetime exercise that ended in total silence. Number 7. HMS Affray. The Amphion-class diesel-electric submarine was the Royal Navy's late Second World War submarine program. HMS Affray, hull number P421, was built by Kamel Laird at Birkenhead and commissioned in November 1945. 86.4 meters long, displacing 1,360 tons surfaced. By the spring of 1951, she was one of the Royal Navy's principal Cold War training boats. On April 16, 1951, Lieutenant John Blackburn, age 28, took her out of Portsmouth for an exercise called Training Spring. The objective was to evaluate a new submarine-launched commando insertion technique and to test an experimental snort mast for prolonged shallow-depth running. The snort was a British adaptation of the German Schnorchel. It allowed a diesel submarine to run submerged on its diesel engines, drawing air through a tube that broke the surface. The technology was still relatively new in 1951. 75 men sailed on the Affray, 50 regular crew, 4 officers, 21 trainee officers from the Royal Navy's Submarine Command Course, 4 Royal Marines for the commando exercise. She left Portsmouth at 4:15 in the afternoon and at 9:15 that night sent her last surface radio message from a position 18 nautical miles south of the Isle of Wight, preparing to dive. She was scheduled to surface at 8 in the morning of April 17th. The signal never came. At 11 that morning, the Royal Navy declared her missing. Operation Subsmash, the largest peacetime submarine search in British naval history, was launched within hours. 24 ships, 4 submarines, and aircraft of RAF Coastal Command searched the western approaches for 2 days. The Amphion class had a silent speed endurance of 90 hours. The Royal Navy held on to hope for 2 full days. On April 19th, the search was suspended. 75 men were declared lost. On June 14th, 1951, HMS Reclaim located the Affray on the lip of Herd's Deep at 86 meters depth, position 50 degrees, 6 minutes north, 1 degree 45 minutes west. The wreck was upright with a slight port list. The snort mast was broken off entirely and lying separately on the seabed. The hatches were all sealed. Watches recovered from the bodies had stopped at 9:50 in the morning, more than 12 hours after the scheduled surfacing. The investigation board, chaired by Vice Admiral Sir John Lang, examined every plausible cause: a residual Second World War sea mine, a battery hydrogen explosion, loss of hydroplane control past crush depth at 240 meters, a faulty induction valve flooding through the snort mast. Commander Edward Stanley proposed a different theory in 1952, that the snort mast hull penetration seal had failed at periscope depth, allowing instantaneous flooding of the engine room. The official verdict was indeterminable. It remains indeterminable today. The Affray is protected under the Protection of Military Remains Act of 1986. Diving is prohibited except by license. A bronze memorial plaque was attached to her conning tower in 1962 by Royal Navy divers from HMS Reclaim. It is still there. The 75 names are inscribed at the Royal Navy Submarine Memorial at HMS Dolphin Gosport. The annual memorial service is held every April. HMS Affray's loss was tragic but contained. America's next Atlantic Cold War accident scattered 4 thermonuclear weapons across Arctic sea ice. Number 8, the 1968 Thule B-52 and the lost Mark 28 secondary. Operation Chrome Dome was the Strategic Air Command's airborne nuclear alert program. Beginning in 1961, the United States kept nuclear-armed bombers in the air 24 hours a day, loitering near Soviet airspace, ready to strike at minutes' notice. Thule Air Base in northwestern Greenland was a critical staging point. The Chrome Dome routes circled overhead. On January 21, 1968, a B-52G nicknamed Hobo 28, tail number 580188 of the 528th Bombardment Squadron, was 35 minutes from the end of its alert mission. A fire broke out in the cockpit. 3 foam cushions, ignited by hot bleed air ducts when overheated heaters were left running, became a cabin inferno within minutes. 6 crew bailed out. Co-pilot Captain Frank Hopkins was killed when his parachute failed at low altitude. The bomber struck the sea ice of North Star Bay at 6:39 Greenwich Mean Time, 12 kilometers from Thule Air Base, at approximately 560 kilometers per hour. 4 B-28 Fi thermonuclear weapons were aboard. Each had a yield of 1 4/10 megatons. The impact and the post-crash fire detonated the conventional high explosive in all 4 bombs. The primary and secondary fissile components scattered across an area of approximately 700 square meters. There was no nuclear detonation, but plutonium-239, uranium-235, americium-241, and tritium contaminated the surrounding ice and seabed. Project Crested Ice was the Joint Air Force and Atomic Energy Commission cleanup. It ran from January through September of 1968. Approximately 500 million liters of contaminated snow and ice were collected, totaling 67,000 cubic meters of debris. All of it was shipped to the Savannah River site in South Carolina for disposal. The cleanup recovered all 4 primary stages, the fission pits at the heart of each bomb. It recovered 3 of the 4 secondary stages, the thermonuclear fusion components. The 4th secondary was never found. United States Navy sonar surveys conducted that summer by USS Thule located a cylindrical object on the seabed at approximately 200 meters depth, 4 kilometers from the impact site. A Star 3 deep-sea submersible was dispatched in August 1968 to retrieve it. The submersible photographed the object but could not grasp it. Weather closed the operating window. The retrieval was abandoned. The United States declared in 1969 that all weapons had been rendered safe and all radioactive components recovered. That statement was contradicted by declassified documents obtained by the BBC in 2008. The documentary, The Thule Affair, presented Air Force paperwork acknowledging the lost secondary and the failed retrieval. The lost component contains approximately 5 kilograms of lithium-6 deuteride and 3 kilograms of weapons-grade uranium-235. Danish glaciologist Eske Willerslev led sediment core sampling in Bylot Sound from 2009 to 2015. Americium-241 and plutonium-239 were detected at trace level 70 kilometers from the crash site, consistent with secondary stage breach. The lost Thule secondary is one of 6 United States thermonuclear weapon components officially classified as irretrievably lost. Of those 6, the most famous still sits in shallower water, closer to American homes. Number 9. The Tybee Island Mark 15 hydrogen bomb. The Mark 15 was a third-generation United States Air Force gravity weapon. Its variable yield ranged from 1.7 to 3.8 megatons. It weighed 7,600 pounds. It was 11 feet 8 inches long and 35 inches in diameter. The Mark 15 Mod 0 variant used a sealed pit primary with Uralloy uranium-235 and a Mark 39 secondary loaded with lithium-6 deuteride. On the night of February 4, 1958, a B-47 Stratojet of the 19th Bombardment Wing, serial number 512349, took off from Homestead Air Force Base in Florida, bound for Lockbourne Air Force Base in Ohio. The mission was a simulated combat profile. At 1:58 in the morning of February 5th, at 38,000 feet over Sylvania, Georgia, the Stratojet collided in midair with an F-86 Sabre flown by Lieutenant Clarence Stewart, who was on a training intercept. The Sabre exploded. Lieutenant Stewart ejected and survived. Major Howard Richardson, piloting the wounded B-47, managed to descend toward Hunter Air Force Base in Savannah. He feared that the damage bomb in the bay might detonate on landing impact. He received permission from the base commander to jettison the weapon over open water. At 7,200 feet over Wausau Sound at 2:12 Eastern Time, he released the Mark 15. The weapon splashed down somewhere in the estuary at the mouth of the Wilmington and Bull Rivers southeast of Savannah. The water depth at the splash zone varies from 4 to 35 feet, depending on tide. The Air Force search began at first light on February 6th. 100 Navy and Air Force divers, including underwater demolition teams with surface vessels equipped with magnetometers and grid sonar, searched a 3-square-mile area. 9 weeks later, on April 16, 1958, the search was suspended. The Air Force declared the weapon irretrievably lost. The official position of the United States government is that the Tybee bomb remains in shallow Atlantic waters within a 1-mile radius of 31 degrees, 53 minutes north, 80 degrees, 59 minutes west. The Air Force has held that position for nearly 70 years. There have been later searches. In 1981, a Pentagon-commissioned magnetometer survey found nothing. In 2001, the United States Army Corps of Engineers conducted another sweep. In 2004, retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Derek Duke, working privately, detected a suspicious sub-bottom anomaly at 31 degrees, 53 minutes, 12 seconds north, 80 degrees, 57 minutes, 58 seconds west, buried under approximately 5 to 15 feet of mud. Subsequent gamma spectroscopy detected nothing. The Air Force returned in 2007 and concluded that the Duke anomaly was natural, possibly iron-rich clay or pre-existing scrap. The weapon contains 400 pounds of Composition B, high explosive, and approximately 600 kilograms of uranium-238 and uranium-235. A 2001 Internal Department of Energy assessment concluded that the high explosive has likely become inert by deterioration after decades of saltwater immersion. Uranium leaching is estimated at less than 0.1 kilograms per year. Tybee Island residents formed an advocacy group, the Tybee Bomb Reclamation Society, in the 1990s. The Air Force has consistently responded that recovery is more dangerous than abandonment. Fishermen drop lines in the suspected area. The Air Force has never restricted the zone. The bomb is unmarked, sealed under decades of estuarine mud, and is likely to stay there for the foreseeable lifespan of human civilization. From buried American mistakes to one of the largest, most identifiable Cold War shipwrecks in the South Atlantic. Number 10. The ARA General Belgrano. The cruiser had a long life before she ended on the bottom of the Drake Passage. She was commissioned in 1938 as USS Phoenix, a Brooklyn-class light cruiser of the United States Navy. She was at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, sitting at her berth on Battleship Row, and emerged from the attack undamaged. She served through the entire Pacific theater of the Second World War, including the Battle of Surigao Strait in October 1944, the last battleship versus battleship engagement in human history. In 1951, she was transferred to Argentina under the United States Mutual Defense Assistance Program. She was renamed ARA 17 de Octubre. After the fall of Juan Perón in 1956, the political symbolism of that name became untenable, and she was renamed ARA General Belgrano. By 1982, she was 44 years old, fitted with 4 Exocet MM-38 missile launchers, added in 1968, but otherwise lightly modernized. She had a crew complement on the morning of May 2, 1982, of approximately 1,138 officers and men. The Falklands War had begun on April 2nd. The British declared a total exclusion zone around the Falkland Islands. The Belgrano, escorted by 2 Argentine destroyers, sailed on a southerly course 36 nautical miles outside the zone. At 55 degrees 27 minutes south, 61 degrees 25 minutes west, she was being tracked by the Royal Navy's nuclear-powered submarine HMS Conqueror, hull number S-48, commanded by Commander Christopher Rafford Brown. At 3:57 in the afternoon, Greenwich Mean Time, the Conqueror fired 3 Mark 8 torpedoes. They were Second World War design weapons, contact-fused, with conventional warheads. 2 of the 3 struck the Belgrano. The first hit forward of the bridge, destroying the bow magazine area. The second hit aft, rupturing the propulsion compartment and knocking out main power. The third missed. The cruiser took on a 17-degree list to port within 4 minutes. Captain Hector Bonso gave the abandoned ship order at 4:01. The Belgrano sank stern first at 4:24, 27 minutes after the first torpedo struck. 323 men died. 53 of them were conscripts under 21 years of age. The 2 escorting Argentine destroyers withdrew without conducting rescue, a decision that remains controversial in Argentine military history. 770 survivors were eventually picked up over 2 days by destroyers and Chilean merchant vessels in Sea State 6 with water temperature near freezing. The wreck lies at 55 degrees 45 minutes south, 61 degrees 37 minutes west, at approximately 4,200 meters depth on the Argentine abyssal plain. The decision to torpedo the Belgrano outside the total exclusion zone was authorized personally by Margaret Thatcher in War Cabinet session. The rules of engagement had been modified hours before the attack. The original rules permitted engagement only inside the zone. The modification authorized attack on any Argentine warship deemed to pose a threat to British forces. The Belgrano remains the only major surface combatant lost to submarine attack since the Second World War. The Argentine government has designated the wreck as a national underwater war grave. Multi-beam sonar surveys conducted by the Argentine Hydrographic Service in 2007 and 2018 confirmed the cruiser is intact in 2 pieces, approximately 200 meters apart on the abyssal plain. The wreck has never been physically surveyed by submersible. The 323 dead include men whose remains have never been recovered. These 10 sites share something the public memory rarely confronts. They are not isolated incidents. They are points on a single, continuous geography of forgetting. The Atlantic was the Cold War's second theater, and in many ways its true operational front line. The Pacific dominates popular memory because Pearl Harbor, the atomic tests, and the Vietnam War all unfolded there. The Atlantic was different. The Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom gap was where every Soviet ballistic missile submarine had to transit to reach its launch positions. The Bay of Biscay and the Iberian Atlantic Basin were the convenient deep-water disposal grounds for Western Europe. The South Atlantic, far from American eyes, became the staging ground for the only formal naval war the Cold War produced. The pattern that emerges from these 10 stories is consistent. State agencies declared losses irretrievable. Press releases sealed the public record. The depth of the Atlantic made interrogation expensive and politically inconvenient. Wives in Long Island, fishermen in Belgium, Inuit cleanup workers in Greenland, and Argentine families in Buenos Aires kept memories alive that national governments preferred to forget. Local memory and institutional amnesia trace opposite arcs. The Atlantic itself accumulates evidence. Sonobuoys at 4,000 meters. Radioactive barrels in the Bay of Biscay. A thermonuclear secondary at the edge of Bylot Sound. A Mark 15 bomb under estuarine mud in Wassaw Sound. A submarine on the lip of Herd's Deep. The cruiser at 4,200 meters in the Drake Passage. None of them are gone. They are simply not visible from the surface. The Cold War was the first conflict in which deliberate seabed disposal became official state policy. It is also the first conflict whose archaeological record we can reliably expect to expand over the coming decades as sonar resolution improves and autonomous underwater vehicles become routine. The technology used to look for what Cold War states buried has improved dramatically. Side-scan sonar, originally developed in the 1940s for anti-submarine warfare, is now commercial deep-water survey standard. Multi-beam echo sounding systems, particularly the Kongsberg EM-122, can map a square kilometer of seabed at 4,000 meter depth in under an hour. Magnetometers, both proton precession and cesium vapor models, detect metal objects buried in sediment. Sub-bottom profilers like the one Derek Duke used at Tybee Island in 2004 can image structures up to 50 meters below the seabed. Autonomous underwater vehicles such as Remus and Hugin have made deep water survey routine. In 2022, the Falklands Maritime Heritage Trust expedition used a Hugin AUV to locate the wreck of Ernest Shackleton's Endurance at 3,000 meters depth. In 2013, the Bezos expeditions recovered Saturn F-1 engines from the Atlantic seabed at 4,300 meters. The same tools could survey any of the 10 sites discussed in this video in a matter of days. Synthetic aperture sonar, developed commercially in the 2010s, can image a wreck without optical contact. The Argentine Hydrographic Service used synthetic aperture sonar to map the Belgrano in 2018 without sending a submersible. The technical limitation is no longer the technology. It is the political and legal constraint. Britain's Protection of Military Remains Act prohibits diving on the Affray without license. Argentina's war grave designation prohibits any survey of the Belgrano. The United States Air Force claims jurisdiction over the Thule and Tybee weapons under Title 10 of the United States Code. The right to know runs into the right of the state to forget. New deep-sea exploration projects funded by the Schmidt Ocean Institute and OceanX have shown interest in Cold War wrecks. Citizen scientists and recreational divers continue to make discoveries within recreational depth limits. None of this is going to be cleaned up. The economics are prohibitive. The most optimistic estimate for recovering the Tybee bomb is $50 million, and that assumes the weapon can be precisely located. A full Tybee excavation, including dredging large volumes of contaminated estuarine mud, could easily reach $500 million. The Thule secondary, in Arctic conditions, at 200 meters depth, beneath thick winter sea ice, would cost an order of magnitude more. Camp Century cleanup estimates range from $200 million to $1 billion just for stabilization, not removal. The Northeast Atlantic radioactive waste dump is physically impossible to recover in any meaningful sense. The 222,000 barrels are spread across hundreds of square kilometers of abyssal plain at 4,400 to 4,800 meters depth. The most ambitious partial recovery scenario, focused on the highest activity drums, would exceed $500 billion. No state has ever appropriated funds for ocean Cold War remediation. The polluter pays principle, central to terrestrial environmental law, has effectively never been applied to seabed military waste. The political question of who pays has no answer: the state that dumped, the state that hosts the waters, or the international community as a whole. Russia's position on the K-class submarines lost to its navy, the K-219, the K-278 Komsomolets, the K-159, is that the reactors and the warheads remain in place under monitored containment. The 1996 International Atomic Energy Agency review of the French Mururoa Atoll nuclear test sites established the modern precedent for a leave-in-place policy. There is a serious scientific case for monitored containment over active recovery. Every recovery operation creates new contamination risk. The deeper the wreck, the less biologically available the contamination becomes. The Air Force's position on the Tybee weapon, that it is safer in place than in transit, is genuinely defensible. The competing case is that radioactive decay slows the longer waste is left undisturbed, while corrosion accelerates. The two trends pull in opposite directions. Plutonium-239 has a half-life of 24,100 years. Cesium-137 has a half-life of 30 years. Decay timescales matter less than corrosion timescales for some isotopes and matter more for others. The result is institutional paralysis. The seabed has become an accidental Cold War archive that no one has both the will and the resources to manage. Climate change is accelerating every one of these problems. Greenland ice melt is happening faster than the 2016 Colgan paper projected. Updated 2024. Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. AR7 scenarios suggest that surface exposure of the Upper Camp Century waste layer could begin between 2070 and 2090, not at the end of the century, as originally modeled. The retreat of Arctic sea ice is improving accessibility to Thule Bay for survey, but it is also increasing radionuclide migration from the crash site. Rising sea levels and coastal erosion at Tybee Island, Georgia, are reshaping the Wausau Sound estuary. The Mark 15 bomb could shift into deeper water within decades. North Atlantic deepwater circulation is changing because of glacial meltwater pulses, and these shifts will affect the dispersion of cesium-137 from the Bay of Biscay dump sites. Increased storm frequency and intensity in the North Atlantic is exposing more sonobuoy debris to surface currents. The Bay of Pigs wrecks are facing Caribbean acidification and the scouring effects of more frequent hurricanes. The Antarctic and Falklands region is warming faster than the global average, increasing sediment movement around the Belgrano wreck. New Arctic shipping lanes opening because of declining sea ice will bring commercial traffic close to the Thule contamination zone. The Mont-Louis sediment deposit at Gute Bank is being redistributed by changing English Channel currents. The Cold War seabed is not static. It is being uncovered, eroded, dispersed, and rerouted by the climate change that the Cold War's industrial economy helped create. There is no comprehensive international monitoring regime for any of these sites. The scientific community has been calling for one since the early 2000s. The political will does not exist. The cumulative scale of what the Cold War left on the Atlantic seabed is staggering. Tens of thousands of metric tons of human-made hardware, hundreds of thousands of radioactive barrels, millions of sonobuoys, dozens of major shipwrecks and submarine losses, several thermonuclear weapons. The Cold War was the first conflict in human history to leave a permanent geological signature on the ocean floor. Land-based Cold War sites can be demolished, repurposed, or simply forgotten. Missile silos in Wyoming are now wheat fields. Radar stations in Greenland have been buried under fresh snow. The Atlantic seabed is different. It is forever, on any meaningful human timescale. From the accidental collapse of Texas Tower 4 to the deliberate sinking of the ARA General Belgrano, the Atlantic was the Cold War's grave. The role of secrecy in shaping which losses are remembered and which are forgotten has not diminished. The disproportionate burden carried by certain regions has not been redistributed. The families of the 28 men who died on Texas Tower 4, the Belgian fishermen near Ostend, the Inuit cleanup workers at Thule, the Argentine families of the Belgrano dead, and the residents of Tybee Island all carry knowledge that nation-states would prefer to bury. The Atlantic, in its silence and its depth, has become the perfect curator of the Cold War's worst secrets. The obligation to remember is real. The difficulty of remembering is structural. The evidence is sealed beneath kilometers of seawater, in international waters where no jurisdiction reaches, in war graves where no one is permitted to look. The abyssal plain at 4,000 meters is the closest thing humanity has built to a Cold War cemetery, and it grows every year as another wreck is mapped, another barrel corrodes, another piece of the secret falls out of memory and into the dark.